If you walk into the British Museum on a busy day, the first thing that hits you isn't a single artifact. It's the feeling that the whole world has been squeezed under one roof. Greek marbles, Assyrian lions, Nigerian bronzes, Egyptian mummies, all of them sitting quietly in London, thousands of miles from where they were made. At first glance, the explanation feels obvious. The British went out, conquered, collected, and brought the trophies home. A simple story of taking. But if it were really that simple, why is so much energy spent insisting these things were acquired legally, preserved for humanity, held in trust? That kind of language suggests a deeper logic at work, something more than just plunder being disguised as generosity. So what kind of institution is this really? A public library of objects? A vault? A monument to empire? The official story starts in the 18th century, long before the sun never set on anything. The museum grows out of a private collection. Hans Sloane's cabinets of curiosities, bought by Parliament to create a national museum. It's funded by the state, free to enter, open to all studious and curious persons. That sounds almost utopian. Knowledge for the public, objects for research, a world on display without a ticket barrier. For a moment, the picture is clean, an enlightenment project, driven by curiosity and classification, and yet, even in that beginning, there's a tension. The word national sits alongside a collection built from things that are not, in any sense, nationally British. It's the kind of detail that doesn't sting until you sit with it. To see how this tension plays out, it helps to zoom in on one set of stones, the Parthenon marbles. Walk into the long, echoing gallery where they sit, and you're surrounded by carved figures that once lined a temple above Athens. Occasionally, you'll see Greek visitors there, standing very still. Not staring in wonder, but in something closer to grief. The simple explanation is that the British stole them. That's how the story is often told. But when you look at the paperwork, another layer appears. At the time, Athens wasn't governed by Greece. It was under Ottoman rule. And Britain's ambassador, Lord Elgin, managed to obtain a document commonly referred to as a firman that he claimed gave him permission to take pieces from the Parthenon. So, now you get a different narrative. Not theft, but permission. Purchased later by the British state, displayed for the world. Legal on paper. The trouble is, that document doesn't survive in its original form. Only an Italian translation. Its wording is vague. It may have allowed drawings and a few fragments to be removed. It almost certainly didn't imagine half the surviving sculptural program shipped off in crates. Even in Elgin's own time, some British voices are appalled. Byron famously rages about those stones of your own land, taken from the shattered heaps. The legality was questioned from the beginning, the morality even more. So we have a museum insisting on legal ownership based on an Ottoman permission slip of dubious scope granted by a foreign empire occupying Greece. It's hard not to feel that the law is being stretched over something it doesn't quite fit. And this is where economics starts to slip in. The British Museum doesn't charge admission. It tells you proudly that it is free, funded by taxpayers. It doesn't sell the marbles. It refuses to treat them as commodities. Yet it fights, quite fiercely, to retain them. If there's no direct profit, why hold on so tightly? Why not simply say, here, take them home? One easy explanation is preservation. For years, the argument was that the British Museum, with its climate control and conservation experts, was better able to care for fragile antiquities than their countries of origin. The idea of London as a safe harbor, compared to unstable regimes or inadequate facilities elsewhere. That line begins to wobble once you look at modern Acropolis museums or new galleries in Lagos, Benin City, Cairo. These are not improvised storehouses. They are world-class spaces. Now, if preservation alone doesn't explain the resistance, what does? Part of the answer lies in the numbers behind the glass cases. The British Museum is one of the most visited sites in the UK. Millions of people come through every year. They spend money in London's hotels, restaurants, shops. They help justify public funding. They contribute to something less tangible, but very real, prestige. The objects don't sit on a balance sheet in the usual way, but they function like assets, cultural capital that can't easily be replaced. Once you start thinking of them like that, the reluctance to give them back stops feeling like abstract principle and starts sounding a lot like asset protection. It's an unsettling thought, because it suggests that the debate over ownership isn't only moral or legal. It's also economic, in a quiet, structural way. Another set of objects makes that tension even starker, the Benin Bronzes. These plaques and heads, created in the Kingdom of Benin in modern-day Nigeria, weren't bought from a local ruler with a dubious permit. They were seized in 1897 during a violent punitive expedition. The city was burned, the royal court was destroyed, bronzes were taken as loot and sold on the European art market. There's no serious claim of legality here, no firman to point to. For a long time, though the justification sounded similar, preservation, public access, study, recently, something has shifted. A number of institutions in Europe and the US have begun returning Benin pieces to Nigeria or agreeing to long-term loans. The moral calculus has become harder to ignore. The British Museum, however, is constrained in a more rigid way. It is bound by the British Museum Act of 1963, which essentially forbids it from deaccessioning objects except in very limited circumstances. Even if the trustees wanted to return major pieces, they are not legally allowed to without a change in the law. On one level, that law looks neutral, a safeguard to prevent a national collection from being sold off or broken up. Dig a little deeper, and it starts to look like something else, as well, a legal wall built around an imperial inheritance. The combination is strange. A museum arguing moral nuance while shielded by a statute that locks its holdings in place. At this point, the questions we ask ourselves start to change. Early on, it's natural to ask, were these things stolen? Were they bought legally? Can they be cared for if returned? Later, another question emerges, quieter but heavier. What does it mean for one country to hold the physical memory of so many others, indefinitely? The British Museum isn't unique in this. The Louvre, the Met, Berlin's museums, they all carry collections shaped by conquest and unequal power. But the British Museum is unusual in how completely it embodies the idea of a world museum, and how tied it is to a specific era when Britain could reach into almost any territory on Earth. If you step back for a moment, it begins to feel less like a building full of objects, and more like a three-dimensional map of historical power. That's an uncomfortable way to see it, because it pushes the conversation away from narrow disputes over single artifacts and toward broader questions about who gets to narrate history. The museum often says that by holding global collections in one place, it allows people to see connections between cultures, to understand human history as a shared story. There's truth in that. Standing in one building and moving from Assyria to Benin to China in an afternoon can be mind-bending in the best way. But the shared story is being arranged, captioned, and interpreted in a specific city, in a specific language, through a specific historical lens. The deeper you follow the trail of charters, export permits, acts of parliament, and insurance valuations, the more the central question shifts. It's no longer just who owns this object. That might have a legal answer, even if contested. It starts to sound more like, who owns the power to decide where meaning lives? Is the Rosetta Stone primarily an Egyptian artifact, tied to a specific soil and sky, or is it now part of a global archive in London? Are the Benin Bronzes royal heirlooms, community memory, or nodes in an international network of art and scholarship? Those aren't questions with easy resolutions, and maybe that's why they keep circling back into public argument. What's striking is how much of this story sits at the junction between money, memory, and law. Public funding, tourism, and national branding on one side, ancestral heritage and cultural identity on the other, and between them, an institution that presents itself as neutral, while resting on the scaffolding of a very particular past. By the time you trace all these threads from Sloane's bequest to Elgin's crates, from Benin's fires to parliamentary acts, you're left with an image that's hard to unsee. A museum that looks like a library, feels like a monument, and behaves in some quiet ways, like a bank. Not a bank that lends money, but one that holds deposits of meaning, gathered under unequal circumstances, paying out interest in prestige and influence rather than cash. And once you start seeing it that way, it's difficult not to wonder what a withdrawal would look like, or who should have the right to request one. I suspect different people will draw very different lines here, between sharing and hoarding, between guardianship and possession, between world heritage and national treasure. That's probably where this story really lives now, not only in the letters of old charters, but in the arguments we have about them, and in how willing we are to imagine ownership as something more complicated than a name on a deed. If you want to keep tracking how power hides in places like this, museums, companies, empires, subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts below, and join me next time as we audit another piece of history.